Lonely gas station worker reluctantly rescued a dying cat, then faced a heartbreaking choice that the hiss of the November wind against the plate glass window of the Last Chance Gas and Go was a familiar soundtrack to Mike Donovan's nights. It swept down from the north, carrying the first true bite of winter across the long, empty stretch of Highway 19 somewhere deep in the Missouri Ozarks. Headlights were rare after midnight, mostly truckers rumbling past on their way to Springfield or further south, their passage marked by a brief tremble in the floorboards and the Doppler shift of engine drone. Mike had just finished his closing routine, counting the till, always disappointingly lean on a Tuesday, wiping down the coffee machine that perpetually smelled faintly burnt, and making sure the hot dog roller was switched off. He wasn't the owner, just the guy who held down the fort from 4 p.m. until midnight, 5 days a week. It wasn't much of a life, but at 58, after the plant closure and then Helen's long illness, it was steady. Steady and quiet. Maybe too quiet. He pushed open the heavy glass door, the bell above it giving a tinny, cheerful jingle that felt entirely out of place in the desolate night. The wind snatched at his thin jacket, reminding him he really needed to replace it before the snows came. He fumbled with the keys, the cold metal biting into his fingertips, and finally heard the satisfying thunk of the deadbolt sliding home, safe for another night. He turned, ready to head to his beat-up Ford pickup parked near the darkened car wash bay, when he heard it. A faint, scraping sound, almost lost beneath the wind's moan. It wasn't the rhythmic scuttling of a raccoon raiding the dumpster, nor the rustle of dry leaves skittering across the asphalt. It was different, more deliberate, yet weak. Scratch, pause, scratch. Mike squinted towards the pump islands. The overhead fluorescent lights cast long, distorted shadows, making the familiar shapes of the pumps seem vaguely menacing. The sound came again, from near pump number 3. He walked slowly, his boots crunching on stray gravel washed onto the concrete apron by the last rain, and then he saw it. Huddled against the base of the pump, trying to gain some meager shelter from the relentless wind, was a cat, a ginger cat. Its fur, the color of faded autumn leaves, looked dull and patchy under the harsh lights. It was terribly thin, ribs showing faintly even through the matted coat. One of its back legs was stretched out at an unnatural angle, limp and useless. As Mike approached, the cat tried to shift, to pull itself further under the pump, but the movement elicited only a dry, hoarse whine, a sound of pure misery that cut through the wind's howl. "Damn," Mike breathed out, the word forming a small white cloud in the frigid air. He wasn't what you call a sentimental man. Life had sanded down most of his softer edges. He'd seen stray dogs and cats around the station before. They usually kept their distance, scavenging for scraps and disappearing back into the woods that bordered the highway. But this was different. The cat wasn't wary or feral. It was defeated. Its golden eyes, wide and reflecting the cold light, held a look of weary resignation. It didn't try to run, didn't hiss. It just lay there, shivering. He crouched down, his knees cracking in protest. The concrete was ice cold. He could see the raw, scraped skin around the cat's hip, where it must have dragged itself. Abandoned, he thought, tossed out of a car window like garbage, maybe miles back, and it had somehow dragged itself this far, seeking the meager light and shelter of the gas station, or maybe it had been hit right here on the highway. The thought tightened something in his chest. "Hey there, fella," Mike said softly, his voice rough from disuse. He rarely spoke more than a few necessary words during his shift. "You're in a bad way, aren't you?" The cat blinked slowly, a tremor running through its small body. It didn't respond, didn't even seem to have the energy to be afraid. Mike hesitated. He had his own troubles. Money was tight. His small apartment behind the station was barely big enough for him, let alone an animal, especially an injured one. Vet bills. He couldn't even think about vet bills. He should just go home, get in his truck, turn the heater on full blast, and forget he ever saw it. Nature's cruel, that's what people said. It wasn't his problem, but the image of those golden eyes, dull with pain and exhaustion, wouldn't leave him. He thought of Helen, how small and frail she'd looked near the end, how helpless. He thought of the crushing loneliness that sometimes settled over him in the dead hours of the night, a silence so profound it felt like drowning. Leaving this creature here felt wrong. It felt like giving up on something more than just a cat. Another gust of wind whipped around the pumps, carrying a few stinging ice pellets. The cat flinched, letting out another pitiful whine. "Ah, hell," Mike muttered, the decision made not with warmth, but with a weary sigh of inevitability. He stood up stiffly and shrugged out of his worn, insulated coat. It wasn't much, but it was warm. Carefully, slowly, he bent down again and gently draped the coat over the shivering animal. The cat stiffened for a second, then seemed to relax slightly into the sudden, unexpected warmth, closing its eyes. Mike slid his hands underneath the coat, mindful of the injured leg. The cat was lighter than he expected, just skin and bones and matted fur. It didn't struggle as he lifted it, just lay limp in the cradle of the heavy fabric. He carried the bundle back towards the station door, fumbling again with the keys, this time his burden making the simple task awkward. Inside, the relative warmth felt immediate. The smell of stale coffee, gasoline, and cheap air freshener hung in the air. Mike carried the cat past the counter, past the racks of chips and candy bars, to the small, cluttered back office that doubled as his break room. An ancient, sagging armchair sat near a small electric fireplace that glowed with fake logs. He cleared a space on the worn, industrial-grade carpet near the hearth and gently lowered the bundle. He unwrapped the coat carefully. The cat lay still, blinking up at him. Its breathing was shallow, but its eyes seemed a fraction clearer now out of the wind. Mike looked down at the small, broken creature, then around the messy office, then back at the cat. "All right," he sighed, running a hand through his thinning gray hair. "All right, just till morning, understand? Then we figure something out." The cat didn't answer, of course. It just watched him with those unnerving, intelligent eyes. Mike filled a shallow plastic lid, the kind that came on tubs of sour cream, with water from the tap in the tiny restroom, and placed it near the cat's head. It ignored it. He rummaged through his own meager lunch bag and found half a tuna sandwich on white bread. He picked out a few flakes of tuna, discarding the bread, and offered them tentatively. The cat sniffed weakly, then, with visible effort, took a small bite, then another. Mike pulled up a rickety metal folding chair and sat down, watching the cat eat. The electric fireplace hummed, casting a warm orange glow. Outside, the wind continued its lonely song against the windows. He should be tired, ready for his own bed in the small apartment out back. But he wasn't. He just sat there, watching the rise and fall of the cat's frail chest, the slow, deliberate way it chewed the tiny pieces of tuna. He hadn't planned this. He didn't want this. Responsibility felt like a lead weight he'd long since shed, or tried to. Yet, here it was, small and ginger and broken, lying on his office floor. He didn't know anything about cats, especially sick ones. He didn't know if it would even make it through the night. But as he sat there in the quiet stillness, the only sounds the hum of the fake fire, the distant rumble of the highway, and the cat's soft chewing, a strange feeling settled over him. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It wasn't even affection. It was just a lessening of the emptiness, a tiny flicker of warmth in the vast, cold landscape of his solitude. He didn't know it then, couldn't possibly comprehend it, but the moment he had knelt in the wind and offered his coat, the quiet, predictable rhythm of his life had irrevocably changed. This small, battered survivor, washed up like wreckage on the shores of his lonely existence, was about to pull him into currents he hadn't navigated in years. He looked at the cat, now finished with the tuna and resting its head wearily on its paws. "Guess I gotta call you something," Mike mumbled. He looked at its reddish-orange fur, dulled by dirt but still vibrant underneath. Rusty. Yeah, fits. Rusty blinked slowly, as if acknowledging the name, then closed his eyes. Mike watched him for a long time, the silence stretching until the first hints of gray dawn began to soften the edges of the night sky outside the window. Morning was coming, and with it, decisions he hadn't expected to make. The gray light of dawn revealed the full extent of Rusty's sorry state. Dried mud and something darker, maybe oil, maybe blood, clumped his fur. The injured leg looked swollen and was clearly causing him pain whenever he inadvertently shifted his weight. Mike knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that the wait-and-see approach wasn't an option. That leg needed a professional eye, and soon. He looked up veterinarians. In the thin, worn phone book he kept under the counter, its pages soft with age. The closest clinic was Doc Green's, over in Cedar Creek, about a 20-minute drive. Mike called as soon as their listed opening time of 8 a.m. rolled around. A cheerful voice answered, sounding jarringly bright to Mike's sleep-deprived ears. "Cedar Creek Veterinary Clinic, Sandy speaking. How can I help you?" Mike cleared his throat. "Yeah, I found a cat. Injured. Looks like a broken leg. Can I bring him in?" "Oh, the poor thing. Of course, bring him right over. Doc Green has surgery this morning, but we can take a look and get him comfortable. Can you tell me the cat's name and your name, sir?" Rusty. The cat's Rusty. My name's Mike Donovan." He felt a pang of awkwardness claiming ownership, even nominally. "Okay, Mike. We'll see you and Rusty soon." Getting Rusty into a makeshift carrier, a sturdy cardboard box lined with an old towel, was easier than Mike expected. The cat seemed too weak, or perhaps too trusting to protest much, just letting out a low moan when the injured leg was inevitably jostled. Mike placed the box gently on the passenger seat of his old pickup. The truck sputtered to life, rattling like it always did on cold mornings. The drive to Cedar Creek felt longer than usual. Mike kept glancing over at the box, listening for any sounds of distress. Rusty was silent. The Ozark Hills rolled by, bare trees stark against the pale sky. It was landscape Mike had seen thousands of times, but today it felt different, charged with an unfamiliar anxiety. He thought about the cost. Doc Green was fair, everyone said so, but fair wasn't free. He mentally calculated the balance in his meager checking account. It would be tight, damn tight. Maybe he could skip replacing that worn tire for another month. Sandy, the receptionist, was as cheerful in person as she'd been on the phone. A plump woman with kind eyes and hair that defied gravity. She took the box gently. "You just wait here, Mike. Doc will be out as soon as he can." The waiting room was clean, but dated, filled with a faint, sharp smell of antiseptic, overlaid with the unmistakable scent of animals. A large, placid golden retriever lay under one chair, thumping its tail occasionally. Mike sat stiffly, feeling out of place. He wasn't an animal person, not really. Helen had always been the one with the soft spot for strays, though they'd never had a pet themselves. Their apartment landlord hadn't allowed it. After what felt like an eternity, a tall, lanky man with wire-rimmed glasses and a receding hairline emerged, wiping his hands on a towel. "This must be Doc Green." "Mike Donovan?" the vet asked, his voice calm and steady. "Yeah. How is he?" Doc Green gave a small sigh. "Well, Rusty's a tough little guy, I'll give him that. Dehydrated, malnourished, and yes, that back leg is broken. A clean fracture of the femur, actually. Looks like he might have been hit by a car, glanced off maybe, rather than a direct impact. Lucky, in a way. He's also got a nasty infection setting in around the joint." Mike's stomach tightened. Can you fix it?" "We can," Doc Green said, nodding slowly. "It'll require surgery. Pins to set the bone, antibiotics for the infection, fluids for the dehydration, and then cage rest for a good few weeks, maybe longer. It's not insignificant." He paused, looking directly at Mike. "And frankly, Mike, it's not cheap." He named a figure that made Mike's breath catch. It was more than he'd feared. It was pretty much everything he had saved, the small buffer against disaster he clung to. Doc Green seemed to read his hesitation. "Look," he said, his voice softening slightly. "He's a stray. You found him. There's options. We can make him comfortable, manage the pain, but without the surgery, that leg won't heal properly. He'll likely lose the use of it, and the infection could get worse. Or..." He left the other unspoken option hanging in the air. Euthanasia. The practical choice. The merciful choice, some might say. Mike looked down at his worn boots. He thought of the gas station, the long silent hours. He thought of the way Rusty had eaten the tuna, the small, determined effort in the face of exhaustion. He thought of those golden eyes looking up at him from the floor of the back office. It wasn't just a stray cat anymore. It was Rusty. "No," Mike said, the word coming out firmer than he expected. "No. Fix him. Do the surgery." Doc Green studied him for a moment, then nodded again. "All right, Mike. We'll take good care of him. He'll need to stay here for a few days, maybe a week, depending on how he does. We'll call you with updates." Mike paid the deposit, a hefty chunk that made his hand tremble slightly as he wrote the check, and walked out into the now bright morning, feeling numb. He'd just spent more money than he could really afford on a stray cat he'd known for less than 12 hours. It was illogical, irresponsible even. He should feel regret, maybe panic. Instead, driving back towards the highway, back towards the last chance gas and go, he felt lighter, like he'd done something right, something that mattered, for the first time in a long while. The next week crawled by. Mike worked his shifts, the gas station feeling emptier, quieter than before. He found himself looking towards the back office, half expecting to see a ginger cat curled by the fake fire. He called the clinic every evening. Sandy usually answered, giving him cheerful updates. Rusty ate all his dinner, or he purred when the technician cleaned his cage today. Doc Green called twice himself after the surgery, reporting that it had gone well, the bone was set, and the antibiotics seemed to be working. Finally, the call came. Rusty could go home. Bringing him back was different. This time, Rusty was in a proper plastic carrier borrowed from the clinic. He looked better. His fur, though still patchy in places where they'd shaved him for the surgery and IVs, had been cleaned. His eyes were brighter, more alert. The injured leg was heavily bandaged and splinted, held stiffly against his body. Back in the office, Mike set up a large dog crate he'd bought secondhand. Another expense, lining it generously with old towels and placing shallow food and water dishes inside. He carefully lifted Rusty from the carrier and settled him into the crate. Rusty sniffed the unfamiliar surroundings, looked up at Mike, and then, surprisingly, started to purr, a deep, rumbling sound that filled the small space. Mike found himself spending most of his breaks, and even lingering after his shifts, sitting on the folding chair near the crate. He talked to Rusty, quiet murmurings about the weather, the slow business day, the rumbling trucks on the highway. He wasn't sure why. He just felt compelled to fill the silence. Rusty would watch him, occasionally blinking slowly or shifting his weight carefully off the splinted leg. Caring for Rusty became a new routine. Cleaning the crate, administering the foul-smelling liquid antibiotics, a process Rusty endured with stoic displeasure. Changing the water, offering small meals of soft food. Mike measured his days by the cat's small improvements. The first time Rusty managed to groom his face with his good front paw. The day his appetite seemed truly robust. The quiet evening spent just listening to him purr. He hadn't realized how deep his own loneliness ran until Rusty started to fill the void. The silence in his small apartment out back still felt vast, but the hours at the station were different now. There was a presence, a small life that depended on him. It was a burden, yes, the worry about the leg healing, the ongoing cost of special food and future vet checkups, but it was also an anchor. One evening, a regular trucker named Sal, a big man with a booming laugh, came in for his usual coffee and rolling papers. He glanced towards the back office where Mike had left the door ajar. "Here you got yourself a mascot, Mike?" Sal asked, stirring 3 sugars into his coffee. Mike felt a surprising flush of defensiveness. "Found him hurt. Just looking after him till he's better." Sal chuckled. "Yeah, that's how it starts. Had a dog wander up to my rig once. Skinny thing. Told myself the same thing. Had her for 12 years. He winked. They get under your skin, them critters." Mike just grunted non-committally, but Sal's words echoed after the trucker left, his rig rumbling off into the night. They get under your skin. Maybe Sal was right. He looked back at the crate where Rusty was now dozing, one paw tucked under his chin. The splinted leg still looked awkward, a stark reminder of the fragility of this new arrangement. But the steady rise and fall of the cat's breathing, the soft rumble of his purr that Mike could hear even from the counter, these small signs of life felt increasingly essential. He wasn't just looking after a stray anymore. He was sharing his quiet corner of the world, and somehow it didn't feel quite so empty. The weeks following Rusty's return from the vet settled into a new kind of normal. Winter tightened its grip on the Ozarks. Frost painted intricate patterns on the gas station windows each morning, and the wind whistling down Highway 19 carried the sharp promise of snow. Inside the small back office, however, a fragile warmth bloomed, centered around the recovering ginger cat. Rusty, confined initially to his crate, proved to be a patient patient. Mike meticulously administered the medications, cleaned the crate, and kept the food and water fresh. He started buying better quality cat food, feeling a pang of guilt about the cheap tuna he'd first offered. He even, feeling faintly ridiculous, bought a small, crinkly ball from the pet aisle at the grocery store. Rusty regarded it with disdain for 3 days. Then, one quiet afternoon, batted it tentatively with his good paw, sending it skittering across the linoleum floor. Mike watched, a rare small smile touching his lips. The follow-up vet visit was a milestone. Doc Green examined the leg, took new x-rays, and declared himself pleased. "Healing up nicely, Mike. Better than I expected, actually. This fella's a fighter." He carefully removed the splint and bandages, revealing a thin leg with a long, shaved patch where the incision had been made. "He'll have a limp," Doc Green warned, gently manipulating the joint. "Probably always will, and arthritis down the road is a near certainty. But he should have decent use of it. Keep him confined for a couple more weeks, limited activity, let those muscles rebuild slowly." Back at the station, freedom from the splint seemed to invigorate Rusty. He began exploring the confines of the office, moving stiffly at first, testing the injured leg with cautious steps. He discovered the undeniable allure of the worn armchair, claiming it as his own, curled up on the faded cushions near the electric fireplace. Mike didn't have the heart to displace him, often finding himself perched on the less comfortable folding chair during his breaks. The gas station office transformed. A scratching post, another slightly embarrassing purchase for Mike, stood in one corner. A proper ceramic water bowl replaced the plastic lid. The air, while still carrying the underlying notes of gasoline and burnt coffee, now also held the faint, dry scent of cat food and the warm, comforting smell of contented feline. Mike found his own routines subtly altered. He'd arrive a little earlier for his shift to check on Rusty, and often linger a little later, reluctant to leave the small pool of warmth and companionship in the office for the echoing silence of his apartment. He talked to Rusty constantly now, the initial awkwardness replaced by a running commentary on his day. Fragments of thought, even memories, dredged up from the deep well of his past. "Cold one tonight, Rusty," he'd murmur, watching the cat meticulously groom his ginger fur. Reminds me of the winter of '98. Snowed so hard the highway shut down for 3 days. Helen and I were stuck in our little apartment, watched old movies, drank cheap wine. She hated being snowed in, but he trailed off, the memory suddenly sharp, poignant. It was happening more often now. Caring for Rusty, this small, dependent creature, cracked open doors in his mind he'd kept bolted shut for years. Helen. Her absence was a constant, dull ache, but the sharp edges of grief had eventually smoothed over, worn down by time and routine, and a determined effort not to feel too much. Now, though, small things brought her back with surprising clarity. The way Rusty looked up at him when he entered the room reminded him of Helen, glancing up from her book. The quiet rhythm of the cat's breathing in the chair beside him echoed the peaceful sounds of shared domesticity he hadn't realized he missed so acutely. He remembered her long illness, the endless hospital visits, the feeling of helplessness as she faded. Had he done enough? Had he been present, truly present in those final months? Or had he retreated into himself, afraid of the inevitable pain? The responsibility he felt for Rusty, the worry over his leg, the commitment to his care, felt intertwined with a resurfacing guilt about Helen. He was pouring care into this stray cat, care he sometimes feared he hadn't adequately given his own wife when it mattered most. The thought was a cold stone in his gut, adding a layer of sorrow to the quiet comfort Rusty provided. One particularly frigid evening, Sandy from the vet clinic stopped by for gas on her way home. She peered into the office, smiling when she saw Rusty snoozing on the armchair. "Well, look at him!" she exclaimed, her voice warm. "Living the life of Riley. He looks wonderful, Mike. You've done such a good job with him." Mike felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. "He's doing okay," he mumbled, trying to sound casual. "Still limps, but Doc said he would." "A limp's a small price to pay," Sandy said kindly. "He wouldn't have made it at all without you. It takes a special kind of person to do what you did, Mike, especially with the cost and—" She hesitated, then plunged ahead gently. "Well, you know, not knowing how things will turn out." Mike nodded, looking away towards the darkened highway. "Yeah, well, it's funny how they find us, isn't it?" Sandy mused, leaning against the counter. "The ones who need us. Or maybe," she added thoughtfully, "the ones we need." Her words hung in the air after she left. The ones we need. Had he needed Rusty? He'd always prided himself on his independence, his ability to get by on his own. He hadn't needed anyone since Helen, or so he'd told himself. But the thought of the gas station without the ginger cat, the thought of returning fully to the profound silence of his former existence, now felt unbearable. He'd let this stray cat burrow under his skin just as Sal had predicted. He was attached, and attachment, Mike knew from bitter experience, was a vulnerability. It opened you up to the possibility of loss, the sharp, tearing pain he'd spent years trying to numb. Rusty was getting older. He'd arrived injured and malnourished. His future was uncertain. The limp was a constant reminder of his fragility. Later that night, long after closing, Mike sat in the office, the only light coming from the hypnotic glow of the fake fireplace. Rusty had woken up and, after a few tentative stretches, hopped down from the chair. He limped over to Mike, rubbing against his legs, his purr a low rumble. Mike reached down, his hand automatically finding the soft fur behind Rusty's ears. The cat leaned into the touch, then, with surprising agility despite the limp, jumped onto Mike's lap. He circled once, twice, then settled down, tucking his paws beneath him, a warm, living weight against Mike's chest. Mike sat perfectly still, his hand resting on Rusty's back, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, the vibration of his purr. In the quiet intimacy of that moment, Mike felt the full force of his connection to this animal, the depth of his unexpected affection. And with it came a wave of emotion, gratitude, comfort, but also a profound, aching sadness. Sadness for Helen, for the companionship lost, for the years spent in self-imposed isolation, and a new, sharp fear. The fear of losing this, too. This fragile ginger cat had not only changed his life, he had reopened his heart, leaving him exposed once more to the bittersweet pain of caring. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside, the silence was filled with the quiet weight of love and the looming shadow of potential loss. The heart of winter descended on the Ozarks, burying the landscape under layers of snow and ice. Highway 19 became treacherous, traffic dwindled further, and the last chance gas and go felt like an isolated outpost against the elements. Inside, however, the small office remained Mike's sanctuary. Rusty, now fully recovered though with a permanent noticeable limp, ruled his small kingdom with quiet dignity. He'd spend hours on the armchair by the electric fire, or batting his crinkly ball with surprising energy, or simply sitting near Mike, a warm, purring presence in the long, quiet hours. Mike had fallen into the rhythm of caring for Rusty so completely that he barely remembered the profound emptiness that had preceded the cat's arrival. He looked forward to the soft nudge against his leg when Rusty wanted attention, the companionable silence as they shared the small space, even the slight annoyance of finding ginger fur clinging stubbornly to his work jacket. He'd started leaving the door between the office and the main counter area slightly ajar during slow periods, and Rusty would sometimes venture out, limping cautiously past the aisles of chips and soda, sniffing the unfamiliar territory before retreating back to the safety of the office. Sal, the trucker, would always greet the cat warmly on his stops. "How's the supervisor tonight, Mike?" He'd boom, and Mike would just grunt. Though a hint of pride warmed him, the bond felt solid, dependable. Rusty was a fixture, a small, steady heartbeat in Mike's otherwise solitary life. He had allowed himself to believe, cautiously, that perhaps this fragile peace could last. But winter, like life, could be cruel in its unpredictability. It started subtly. One morning, Mike noticed Rusty hadn't finished his breakfast, leaving more than half of the expensive wet food he usually devoured. The cat seemed lethargic, choosing to sleep in his crate rather than on the favorite armchair. Mike told himself it was just a temporary malaise. Maybe something Rusty ate didn't agree with him. By evening, however, there was no denying something was wrong. Rusty refused his dinner entirely, not even showing interest when Mike opened a tin of tuna, a treat usually met with enthusiastic meows. He barely moved, his breathing seeming shallow. When Mike gently stroked him, Rusty didn't purr. Instead, he let out a low, pained sigh. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Mike's careful composure. He checked the time. It was nearly 9 hours p.m. The Cedar Creek Clinic would be closed. He remembered Doc Green mentioning an emergency number on his invoice. Mike's hands trembled as he fumbled for the worn piece of paper in his wallet. He dialed, his heart pounding against his ribs. Doc Green answered himself, his voice thick with sleep but immediately alert when Mike explained the situation. "Bring him in, Mike. Meet me at the clinic in half an hour." The drive was a nightmare. Snow had started falling again, thick flakes swirling in the headlight beams, making the winding road slick and dangerous. Mike gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, eyes darting between the treacherous road and the carrier on the passenger seat, where Rusty lay unnervingly still. Every minute felt like an hour. The fear that had been a dull shadow since Rusty's arrival now consumed him, cold and suffocating. It felt terrifyingly familiar, echoing the panicked drives to the hospital during Helen's final months. Doc Green met him at the back door of the darkened clinic. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of the examination room, Rusty looked even smaller, more fragile. Doc Green's examination was quiet, thorough. He listened to Rusty's chest, felt his abdomen, checked his temperature. His usual calm demeanor seemed strained. "His breathing is labored, Mike," the vet said finally, his voice low, "and he seems painful in his abdomen. Given his history, the trauma, there could be underlying damage we didn't catch or something else entirely. We need to run some tests. Blood work, x-rays, maybe an ultrasound." Mike just nodded numbly, the cost barely registering this time. "Do whatever you need to do." He waited again in the sterile quiet of the waiting room, the clock on the wall ticking with agonizing slowness. The cheerful posters of happy pets seemed like a cruel mockery. This time felt different, heavier than the first visit. Rusty wasn't just a stray he'd rescued, he was family, the only family Mike had left. Hours passed. Finally, Doc Green emerged, his face grim. Mike stood up, bracing himself. "The x-rays show some fluid buildup around his lungs, Mike," Doc Green began, his voice gentle but direct. "And the blood work, it's not good. His kidney values are extremely high. It looks like acute kidney failure." "Kidney failure?" Mike repeated, the words feeling foreign, unreal. "But how? Was it the accident?" "It's possible the initial trauma caused damage that's only showing up now," Doc Green explained patiently. "Or it could be an underlying condition, something congenital, exacerbated by the stress his body went through. Sometimes we just don't know the cause. The important thing is, it's very serious." "What can you do?" Mike asked, his voice hoarse. Doc Green sighed, running a hand over his tired face. "We can try aggressive fluid therapy, try to flush the kidneys, put him on medications to manage the symptoms, hospitalize him, monitor him closely. But Mike," he met Mike's eyes directly, "the prognosis is very poor. Even with intensive treatment, the chances of recovery are slim. Kidney failure in cats, especially this acute, is often irreversible." He laid out the options starkly. The intensive care would be expensive, requiring days, maybe weeks of hospitalization with no guarantee of success. It might prolong Rusty's life, but his quality of life could be severely compromised. The alternative was palliative care, managing his pain, keeping him comfortable either at the clinic or at home until it was time. The unspoken choice hung heavy in the air again. Euthanasia, ending the suffering. Mike felt the floor tilt beneath him. He sank back into a chair, burying his face in his hands. The image of Rusty, curled trustingly on his lap just days before, flashed in his mind. The sound of his purr, the warmth of his small body. How could he give up on him? But the thought of putting Rusty through painful, invasive treatments that likely wouldn't work, keeping him alive only for his own sake, that felt unbearably selfish. He thought of Helen again, the agonizing decisions near the end, the tubes, the machines, the false hope, clinging desperately against the inevitable decline. Had they prolonged her suffering? The question had haunted him for years. He couldn't bear the thought of making the same mistake with Rusty. What would you do, Doc?" Mike asked, his voice barely a whisper. Doc Green sat down opposite him. "There's no easy answer, Mike. If he were my cat, knowing the odds, seeing how sick he is, I'd focus on keeping him comfortable, avoiding painful interventions that likely won't change the outcome, giving him peace and love for whatever time he has left." Tears welled in Mike's eyes, hot and stinging. He hadn't cried, not really, since Helen's funeral. He scrubbed at his face furiously with the back of his hand. Can I see him?" Doc Green led him back to the treatment area. Rusty was lying in a warmed cage, an IV line already inserted into his good front leg, dripping clear fluid. His eyes were half closed, his breathing still shallow. Mike reached a trembling hand through the bars, stroking the soft fur on Rusty's head. "Hey, fella," he choked out. "Hey, Rusty." Rusty didn't open his eyes, didn't purr, but seemed to lean slightly into the touch, a minuscule movement that shattered Mike's remaining composure. He stood there for a long time, whispering to the cat, telling him he was a good boy, telling him he was loved. The decision felt like tearing out a piece of his own soul, but he knew what he had to do. He couldn't subject Rusty to a painful, frightening, and likely futile battle just to delay the inevitable. He owed him better than that. He owed him peace. "All right, Doc," Mike said, his voice thick with unshed tears as he finally turned away from the cage. Let's just keep him comfortable. No heroics, just comfort." He paused, struggling to get the next words out. Can I take him home?" Doc Green looked surprised, then thoughtful. "Usually, we'd monitor him here, but given the situation, yes, I think that would be best. Let him be somewhere he feels safe. I'll get you pain medication, show you how to administer subcutaneous fluids if needed, just to keep him hydrated and comfortable. But Mike, you need to be prepared. It might not be long." Mike nodded, unable to speak. He knew. He was choosing to carry the weight of this final vigil himself, back in the small, quiet office where their unlikely friendship had begun. He was choosing to face the ending head-on, armed only with the difficult, painful love he felt for the small ginger cat who had stumbled into his life and changed everything. The drive back to the gas station, with Rusty quiet in the carrier beside him, felt like the longest journey of his life, each mile heavy with the sorrow of impending goodbye. Bringing Rusty back to the gas station office felt both right and heartbreakingly wrong. The familiar space, usually a source of comfort, now seemed imbued with a heavy sense of finality. Mike settled Rusty onto the worn armchair, tucking a soft blanket around him. The electric fireplace cast a warm orange glow, just as it had on the first night, but the atmosphere was thick with sorrow. Doc Green had sent him home with pain medication, subcutaneous fluids, syringes, and instructions delivered with quiet compassion. Mike, clumsy at first, learned to administer the injections, warming the fluid bag as instructed, gently pinching Rusty's scruff. The cat barely reacted, accepting the ministrations with a weary tolerance that tore at Mike's heart. Time warped. Days and nights blurred into a cycle of quiet care. Mike barely slept, dozing fitfully in the folding chair pulled close to the armchair. He kept the gas station running on autopilot, serving the few customers with a detached efficiency, his thoughts constantly drifting back to the small, still form in the office. He spoke to Rusty constantly, quiet reassurances, fragments of memories, apologies for not finding him sooner, for not being able to fix this. "You're a good boy, Rusty," he'd murmur, stroking the cat's head, his voice thick. "Such a good boy." Rusty rarely moved now. His breathing was shallow, sometimes punctuated by a faint sigh. The deep, rumbling purr that had become the soundtrack to Mike's evenings was gone, replaced by an unnerving quiet. Yet sometimes, when Mike spoke or stroked him, Rusty's ear would twitch almost imperceptibly, or his eyes would briefly open, dull but seemingly aware of Mike's presence. These tiny acknowledgments were slivers of connection Mike clung to desperately. He knew the end was near. Each hour felt borrowed, precious, and agonizing. He saw the gradual fading, the slow withdrawal from the world. He felt helpless, yet profoundly grateful for these last quiet moments, this final, painful act of love. It was so different from the chaotic, clinical ending Helen had faced. This felt intimate, sorrowful, but strangely peaceful. It happened late one night, about 3 days after returning from the clinic. A storm raged outside, rattling the windows with wind and freezing rain, the kind of night where the world felt stripped bare. Mike was sitting on the floor beside the armchair, his hand resting gently on Rusty's side, feeling the faint rise and fall of his chest. He was talking softly, recounting the story of how he'd found Rusty by pump number 3, huddled against the wind. Suddenly, Rusty stirred. He lifted his head slightly, a flicker of the old alertness in his eyes. He looked directly at Mike, a long, steady gaze. Then he let out one last, soft sigh, a mere whisper of breath, and his body went still. The faint rhythm beneath Mike's hand ceased. The silence that followed was absolute, deafening. It pressed in on Mike, heavier than the storm outside. Rusty was gone. Mike sat there for a long time, unmoving, his hand still resting on the warm, motionless fur. Tears streamed down his face, silent and unchecked. It wasn't the raw, panicked grief of losing Helen, but a deep, aching sorrow, a profound sense of loss for the small creature who had unexpectedly burrowed his way into the desolate corners of his heart. He wept for the lost purr, the comforting weight on his lap, the silent companionship that had made the long nights bearable. He wept for the sheer unfairness of it, the brevity of their time together. Eventually, the cold reality began to seep in. He gently lifted Rusty's frail body, wrapping him carefully in the soft blanket he'd been lying on. He held him close for a moment, whispering a final goodbye, then laid him gently in the cardboard box he'd first used to take him to the vet. He called Doc Green's emergency line again. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion as he reported the news. Doc Green offered condolences, his voice filled with genuine sympathy. "You gave him a good ending, Mike," he said softly. "You did right by him." Mike didn't want Rusty to be buried at some anonymous pet cemetery. He wanted him close. The next morning, after the storm had passed, leaving behind a world encased in glittering ice, Mike took a shovel from the station supply closet. Behind the station, near the edge of the woods where the trees stood thick and silent, he dug a small, deep grave in the semi-frozen earth. It was hard work, the shovel scraping against resistant soil and roots, but Mike worked steadily, fueled by grief and a sense of purpose. He lined the bottom with soft towels, placed the box gently inside, and covered it over, packing the earth firmly. He stood for a long while, head bowed, marking the spot not with a stone, but with memory. The following weeks were hard. The silence in the office was immense, overwhelming. Mike found himself glancing constantly at the armchair, expecting to see a ginger cat curled up, only to be met with emptiness. The routines he'd built around Rusty, the feeding times, the medication schedule, the quiet companionship, left gaping holes in his day. The loneliness he thought he'd conquered returned, sharper now for the contrast. But something was different. The grief was real, a heavy weight he carried constantly. Yet the walls he had built around himself didn't go back up completely. Rusty had chipped away at them, let in some light, some warmth, and the memory of that persisted. He found himself talking more to Sal, asking about his roots, listening to his stories. He exchanged more than just polite necessities with Sandy when he stopped by the vet clinic for supplies, asking after other animals, sharing a brief, sad smile of understanding. He even started putting out a bowl of dry food near the back door, just in case other strays passed through, though he knew deep down he wasn't ready, might never be ready, to open himself up to that specific kind of potential heartbreak again. He kept the worn armchair in the office, even though seeing it empty sometimes brought a fresh wave of sadness. He taped a small, slightly blurry photo of Rusty, one he'd snapped on his old phone when the cat was batting the crinkly ball, to the side of the cash register. Customers sometimes asked about it. "That was Rusty," Mike would say, his voice quiet but steady. "He was my cat for a while." He was still Mike Donovan, the quiet man working the late shift at the Last Chance Gas and Go on Highway 19. He was still solitary, marked by past losses. But he wasn't entirely the same. The encounter by pump number 3, the reluctant rescue, the months of shared quiet, and the final painful goodbye had irrevocably changed him. He had learned again the terrible vulnerability and the profound gift of connection. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled across the deserted highway, Mike would stand at the station door, looking out towards the darkness where the woods began. He was alone, the silence stretching around him. But it wasn't the crushing, empty silence of before. It was a silence filled with echoes, the echo of a faint scratching sound, the memory of a low purr, the persistent warmth of a small ginger cat who had briefly, unexpectedly, shared his life and left an indelible mark on his weary heart. And somehow, that made all the difference.